The MLP offseason is already off and running. We already have two blockbuster trades that we need to break down. In this video, I'll be collaborating with Erik Tice from the Dink. We'll be talking about those trades, and we'll be going through each roster of all 16 Premier League teams and trying to predict what these teams are going to look like in 2025. Who's going to be added? Who's going to be dropped? I'm really excited about this video. I hope you enjoy it, so let's get after it. Before we get into the meat of this video, we do have to talk about some important changes for 2025 and just a little rules refresher. If you're already familiar with these changes and rules, well, feel free to jump ahead. And if not, I'll try to make it quick. Most notable for 2025, this is the first time ever that we have keepers. There will be roster continuity from year to year. In the past, we always just had a full redraft. That is not the case anymore. You'll recall there was an auction draft in 2024. Well, if you want to keep a player, you have to pay the league half of the value that they went for in that auction draft last year. Teams can keep two players for an additional 2 years and one player for an additional 1 year. They have to drop at least one player. To be eligible to be a keeper, all players must have signed a MLP contract, and they have to have been one of the originally drafted players. This means Kwang Duong from the Texas Rangers, who was added in a subsequent waiver period after the initial draft, not an eligible keeper. Also, a player like Will House, who, to my knowledge, as of the recording of this video, has not signed an MLP contract, not an eligible keeper. All players that are being dropped will be announced by February 16th. On Sunday, March 2nd, there will be the Premier League auction free agency draft. They're calling it free agency, but it's not really free agency. There's going to be another auction draft for all players who have been dropped or who are not currently on a Major League Pickleball roster and are eligible to be added to a roster. There is no spending limit in this free agency auction, and the minimum for a draft slot is $10,000. Players that are drafted in this auction draft can be kept for up to 3 years. Another big change is rosters are increasing from 4 players to 6 players. There will now be 3 men and 3 women on every Major League Pickleball Premier League team roster. Lineups will be set a day in advance, and you will select which 2 men and 2 women will participate in all matches and all games in a given day. There's a lot more nuances that we'll get into, but that should be enough to at least get us started. So with that in mind, let's get after it. All right, everybody, welcoming back to the channel is Erik Tice. Erik, you just wrote a pretty comprehensive piece about, MLP offseason roster predictions, only to more or less have to tear it to pieces after the first trade came through. What were your thoughts on this blockbuster trade?
Yeah, so there was 2 trades that happened. The New York Hustlers were involved in both. The Columbus Sliders traded Riley and Cash for CJ Klinger. And then also the DC Pickleball Team traded Viv Glausman and Cash for Jackie Kawamoto. So those were the 2 trades that happened. My initial thoughts are, if you look at the graph that you're referring to in my article, New York went from having a team salary of $495,500 to now owing their players $627,000. So one might think, oh, wow, New York is like all in on just buying the best players. We now technically on their roster right now is Riley Newman, Jack Sock, Leah Jansen, and Viv Glausman. But Jack and Riley combined is going to cost New York over $500,000 to keep on their team for this upcoming year, and I just don't see it happening. So I think this was actually a salary dump, or not a salary dump, but a way to cut down on costs for the Hustlers and get some capital in terms of the trade cash so that they're more able to have purchasing power when this free agency draft thing happens.
Definitely at first glance, it just felt a little weird. I think people would still consider Riley Newman to be a better player right now than CJ Klinger. So seeing Riley plus Cash for CJ Klinger definitely threw me for a loop at first glance. But I mean, you just look at CJ Klinger for $1,000 as his keeper price. That might be one of the better bargains out there, especially with just the way his trajectory looks. Getting him back to his hometown Columbus team makes a lot of sense for that franchise. And I really have to agree with you that I don't think we're done seeing New York make changes. Will they stick with Jack Sock, who probably was maybe the biggest underperformer in terms of those elite level of players who went for over 500,000 in the original auction? He'd be, what do you say, 275 to keep him this time
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
I do have it on record from a source. That's right. I've got sources. I did a little homework that he did help bring in some sponsorship money. So he's not only money out the door, he does bring in a little bit of money. Maybe that factors into it. It'll be interesting to see if he does end up getting cut, if he ends up going to a team for lower than what it would cost to keep him. A lot of these high end left side players are going to cost upwards of $200,000 to keep this season. Is that what the price is going to be in the free market? It's tough to say. Like it's really hard to wrap my head around how much teams are going to be willing to spend. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that? Like how much money do you think these players are going to go for once we actually hit the free agency?
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept because this year, again, is almost totally different from any other year. And I know that this is, the second year after a merger. So, we had last year, but remember last year, every team got the 500,000
Hmm.
free draft points. And so, going to a million wasn't that big of a deal for most teams because really they were only going to 500 in terms of their own cash. But now, they're on the hook for whatever amount. There's no limit, right?
Hmm.
But there's also in that, first of all, we're going to have six teams on, or six players on a team. So that goes into your draft
Hmm.
strategy. Um, also, in talking to my sources, I feel like a lot of the dominant left side guys, it feels like to me, a lot of people in the league feel like they're a little bit overrated in terms of how much it's going to cost to keep them. I personally think like James Ignatowicz is probably going to get cut from DC just because of his cost
Hmm.
comparatively to the rest of the three, right? So if you're another team, do you want to maybe offer DC a little bit of cash and take on his salary knowing that you can keep him? Or do you hope that DC drops him and then you can pick him up for cheaper in the free agency draft? There's a lot at play here, and we don't really know who the teams are that want to spend a lot versus who don't want to spend a lot. And that's part of why this prediction part is very difficult.
You mentioned the roster size is increasing. Like, yeah, that's important. We're going from 48 players in Premier League to 96 players in Premier League, while simultaneously thinning out the player pool just a little bit by requiring them to have a UPA contract. So that's definitely going to be a factor in. That's kind of another important thing to keep in mind is like, what is the replacement level of player? Like, if you say you do part ways with James Ignatowicz, if you're a DC, um, what kind of player are you looking at actually to replace him? It's really hard to wrap my head around
Right.
like who does that look like? We don't have a list of the available players. We don't know who's signed what contract. There's not a lot of visibility into that. It just makes this even a harder task to try to predict what's going to happen. But we are committed to trying to do it anyway.
We
Uh,
are.
Another thing to keep in mind is I think there are some premier level players that are stuck down on challenger level rosters that didn't get promoted. You are allowed, as far as I understand, to trade between the leagues. Do we see any of those teams that are in Challenger League this upcoming season? Are they going to become sellers and send those players back up to Premier? You have Elise Jones down there. You have Pablo Tellez. You've got Travis Rettenmeyer, a handful of players with Premier League experience. That's just another thing to keep in mind, too. So with that all kind of in mind, the things we're trying to juggle, I say we just kind of start jumping into your article and let's start at the top with I believe you had the most expensive team was the Orlando Squeeze in terms of salary entering this free agency period. What are we expecting
Right.
to see them do?
So yeah, they're at $635,000 owed to the league to retain all of their players. Obviously, they can't retain all of their players. We have Fed, we have Megan Dazan, we have Tyson and Viv David. Fed costs 200 to keep, and Tyson costs 145 to keep. I mean, they didn't have the greatest 2024 MLP season. I think both of them got sick a little bit and
Hmm.
had some like issues,
Probably the
but
team
they're
that was most impacted negatively by just absences, other than maybe LA, obviously missing Thomas
right.
Wilson.
Yeah.
But Orlando had an event where it
Yeah.
was Paris Todd and three subs. Like they had an okay season when they were healthy.
And they won.
I know. That was fun.
Okay. It was fun. For the cost they have for Fed and Tyson, I don't see them moving off of them. They play well together. They seem to like each other. So I think they keep them and then they try to trade either Megan Dazan or Viv David.
Hmm. Probably just
They're
looking
very
at
similar in price.
maximizing the cash you can get from somebody who like maybe one of these teams that just got promoted that doesn't have a full roster. Maybe they become buyers of one of these women that don't really seem to fit that well together. I agree with you. I think we're going to see them move on from one of those players.
Yep, and the both of them are better on the right side, so it doesn't
Hmm.
really make. I mean, with a six-player roster, it definitely makes sense to keep both of them if they got like a true left side woman. But with the price tag for both of them as right side women, it just doesn't make that much sense to me. If anybody is willing to give them some cash for either of them, I think they probably take it.
So before we move on, I just want to get your opinion on one more thing about these rosters expanding. My logic is kind of that it doesn't really change as much as we think. Like how many teams are actually going to have a third man or a third woman that they really think is viable to swap in here and there. In my opinion, it feels like it's going to be more to me that it's just the same subsystem where last year if you had to do a sub, you were kind of hosed. It was going to be a tough challenge to overcome, and I think that's still going to be the case this year. But you just have more control. It's your player. Do you think teams are going to really try to like have a third player that they could sub in and go win the matches, or is it just going to be more or less used as a sub?
So that's an interesting question because I think it depends on where the rule lands. And I know that sounds theoretical, but here's what I'm saying. As I know the rule right now, in speaking with MLP officials, the rule is you have to have your entire lineup done the day before and every day, right? So if we're playing Thursday, my lineup needs to be set on Wednesday, and I have to have the same people in that lineup all day. So essentially, I can't be like I can't be putting one guy in for men's and then swap him out
Hmm.
and then have him play mixed. So to your point, if that rule stays that way, then yeah, I agree 100%. We're focusing almost solely on the top four players. And then most teams won't really care about their fifth and sixth player because they're not going to play them a much. But I think there's a growing sentiment that it would be more storylines and all of those things if you could do something like that. Like, for example, right now in this system, Colin Johns isn't that useful because he's
Hmm.
great in men's, but when it comes to mix, he's just not as good, right?
Hmm.
But let's say they change the rule where we still set our lineups a day ahead, but I can put Colin in for men's, and then let's just say I get a cheaper left side guy. Michael Lloyd. It gets picked up in Premier, so he's on Colin Johns' team. He doesn't play men's. He just plays mixed. Now all of a sudden we have storylines, we have strategy involved, GM coaching involved, and I think that could go a long way. But if the rule stays the same, where I can't sub in different games or matches, then I don't. I think you're right.
And another kind of wrinkle of the theoretical situation you just talked about, where again using Michael Lloyd as your hypothetical player they had, all of a sudden we've got singles specialists on rosters that are coming in from
Right?
Dream Breakers.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I do kind of like it's almost like having the designated hitter in baseball. I don't know if I would like having single specialists. I like that if you want to like have a Colin Johns, you're kind of stuck with him through the things he's good at and bad at. But I also can see the argument for it can make for a better project and there is more strategic elements and you actually feel like you have more of a roster that's impactful rather than just subs. So that's definitely
Yeah.
interesting to keep in mind. So with all that kind of out of the way, let's just keep moving on down the list of teams here, where we get to the Columbus Sliders, one of the teams involved in that trade yesterday. They now have CJ Klinger kind of as their, I guess, building block on the men's side.
And then we have Paris Todd at 92,500, Callie Smith at 74, and Jay DeVilliers at 67.5. So their total cost to keep all four players, again, they can't do that, is 235,000. What are your thoughts on who they keep, I mean, they already made one trade. Do we see another trade in the works, or what are you thinking?
My prediction here is that if you have a CJ Klinger, obviously he's going to be playing on the right. He's a lefty. I think my number one target for them, and maybe for a lot of teams, would be Kwang Duong. We know he's one of the players that has to get dropped by the Texas Rangers because he was not originally
Right.
drafted. And we've seen CJ and Kwang have success playing on the PPA tour together. They had a nice semifinal run towards the end of the year last year. I just think that would be such a fun young team that I think that would be what I would do. I would probably try to either move on from Jay, see if anybody wants to buy him. Maybe one of these teams that just promoted from Challenger that doesn't have a complete roster would be interested in him. He's pretty good value. He's not like super expensive. He's not going to break your bank. So I think he has some value just based on his contract. But I'm expecting to see them move on from Jay.
There is no rule saying I can't drop a player, and then pick that player right
That's
back
true.
up, right? So, worst case scenario, we drop Jay and we don't get a player we want instead of him. We pay a little bit more for him, but he can't cost that much more than he
Hmm.
already costs. So I think the risk versus reward makes sense there. I also think they probably move on from Cali,
Hmm.
whether that's via trade or drop. I could be wrong on that one, but and also to talk about the Kwong thing, Kwong and CJ play very well together, and Kwong played well with Paris recently.
Hmm.
So I think that could be a good building block for a team. So the Mad Drops is probably the easiest one in history, I think, maybe. They have Catherine Parento that costs 220,000, Thomas Wilson at 185, Jade only costs 85,000, which is
That is
crazy,
wow.
and Hunter a steal at 10,000. So, listen, I mean, I love the guy, and I really, 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 really hope to see him playing pickleball in 2025. But with the health issues, I think they just have to drop Thomas
Hmm.
and pick up a new player.
Everybody in pro pickleball misses Thomas Wilson. I think that's
Yeah,
not a controversial take at all, but you just have to drop him just if he's not going to be available.
yeah. And in my article, I hinted at this, but Julian Arnold, I'd really like to see you playing MLP again. Please make it happen. Thank
Man, if
you.
that happens, they're kind of almost running back the 2023 season one Mad Drops team. That kind of was surprising to a lot of people, aren't they?
Very good memory, sir. Very good.
Moving on to another team that, if all these players were under UPA contracts, would have a really interesting decision to make.
I
However,
know it would be so much more interesting if they were all under
it's true.
contract.
So we have the New Jersey Fives, and Will House is the odd man out in terms of, at least to our knowledge, at this point, being signed to whatever contract he needs to sign to be able to play. So they have to drop him. But if he was signed to a contract, do you keep Zane? Do you keep Will? Do you keep Mari? It becomes really interesting.
If he does sign, I don't I don't know what they do. Zane is a really good captain. Mari is Mari, like she's a very good left side woman. Like I don't know. I'm glad that I'm not the GM for
Yeah.
the
If
Fives.
Will does sign, I'm almost tempted to move on from Mari Humberg just because you'd have to imagine that Anna Lee is going to be able to win in women's doubles with just about any player. And you look at Mari and Zane didn't play that well, so maybe that's the move you make. Although she is good value for the $49,000, maybe in that case you make the argument that you just move on from Zane, as good as he is as a captain and the ultimate
Yeah.
glue guy, locker room guy, whatever you want to call him. He's also pretty good at pickleball, I guess.
If Will doesn't sign, there's not much of a storyline here.
Yep, agreed. So with that, I think we move on to what I'm going to say is one of the two most interesting teams and decisions they have to make. This is the St. Louis Shock, and
Agreed.
all four of their players have a lot of value. You do have,
They
Anna
do.
Bright and Hayden Patrickman, who, I mean, are just tremendous players. And then the other mixed line was pretty weak last year. Of all the mixed teams that played the entire season together, they were the worst statistically in terms of games won, win percentage. This team was like right on the cusp. They were like one of the best teams all year. Like, what do you do here?
Real quick, let's go to their costs just so
Mhm.
everybody's aware. Anna Bright costs 295, Hayden costs 102.5 thousand. Gabe is going to cost 92 and a half, and then Kate costs $8,500. There's really three options I see happening here. We drop Kate, or we drop Gabe, or we trade Kate. If they drop either of the players, I think St. Louis has enough money and they just don't care about money. They care about winning. I think they just pick up whoever they drop with the first overall auction bid. I don't know what that'll cost.
Mhm.
Um,
And that's where
but
it gets
Kate,
interesting is, do you drop Kate or do you drop Gabe if you're going to buy them back? Like, who would go for cheaper, you know?
in my opinion, if it was me, I would probably drop Gabe and pick him back up with the first or second pick because you'll kind of know as you're bidding against the other teams who they're going for, and they're
Mhm.
probably going to be going for left side guys, and Gabe is the right side guy. So I think you could get away with letting a couple people get some left side guys before you pick him back up. But if Kate gets dropped, I think she's one of the first females, probably the
Mhm.
first female to be picked up. So I think she's going to cost more.
And if you do want to, if you're not trying to drop and then buy them right back. They both do have tremendous trade value in terms of the amount of cash that you could get in the
Oh,
door
for
just because
sure.
they're cheap and they're talented and they're both on the come up. So definitely interesting there. Another thing, when you think Anna Bright, you got to think what she's done in the past with going for lesser known partners to play with. Rachel Rohrbacher was kind of a surprise pick in 2023. And obviously, look what she's done. Kate Fahey was the pick in 2024, and now she's kind of a stock riser. Does Anna Bright have another top secret name that she's going to pull out for her next partner? Who knows?
One other thing that just to add in another wrinkle, Gabe just signed with the UPA on a 3-year deal. And of note in the rules this year, a player that's picked up in the 2025 free agency draft is eligible to be kept for 3 more years.
Mm-hmm.
So by dropping Gabe and picking him back up, now you have control of him in 25, 26, and 27. So these teams that are questioning whether or not they're going to drop a player, it may err on the side of drop to re-pick up and then gain control of that player for 1 more extra year.
That's an interesting wrinkle too. There's just a lot of moving parts, and it's
Yeah.
definitely would be an interesting time to be a GM. And I think I was talking with my dad the other day. He's pretty happy to have given up the reins of being the GM of the Ranchers to let it be someone else's headache to figure out what to do. So moving along now, we
Um,
go to the New York Hustlers, another team we talked about briefly already. They made the trade. Now they have Jack Sock and Riley Newman. We don't think they're going to keep that together. It would be an interesting pairing. You have Jack on the left, Riley on the right. I mean, it would be fun. I'd watch it. And then rounding out that team, they now have Vivian Glosman, who costs $0 to keep going forward because she was traded up from Challenger. They also have Leah Jansen.
and Leia costs 77,000 to keep, and both the guys cost 275, which is by far the most 2 players on one team costs to keep. That's 550,000 for you non-mathers. Listen, there's just no way New York is keeping both of those guys. In fact, I don't think they're going to keep either. I wouldn't be surprised to see Riley traded or Jack traded if another team is looking for them, or one or both are dropped. Leia also has a ton of trade value because she's obviously a top 15 women in doubles and a top 3 women in singles.
I agree with you. I mean, I think it's hard to just say anything. We just got to wait for the next move on this team, and we'll see what they do.
Yeah,
We know we think one's coming, so we'll by the time we upload this, hell, maybe they've even made another trade. So
right.
I just talked about them briefly. I'm wearing the hat. Let's see if I've got any homer takes to unload on y'all. We have the Texas Ranchers, who, again, not much of a decision to make because it has been made for them because Kwang Duong was added in a shuffle draft or waiver period. He was not originally drafted. He is not eligible as a keeper. He will go into the player pool and presumably will go to the highest bidder. And I mentioned I think this could be a player that Columbus is looking for, but I mean, Texas they made the semifinals. You
Hmm.
got to imagine that they're considering trying to just run it back.
Listen, Christian costs 265, but Christian's the second best guy in mixed and extremely good in men's, right? Like, so
And he's
he's worth
versatile and
every
he gives you
penny.
singles. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, he's a complete package, and you have Etta and Tina who played great. Etta had those health concerns, but I think they're kind of over now. So I don't know. I mean, she does cost a lot, 157, but I think they just run. I think they try to run it back and see what happens. Like you said, the decision's already made for them. They have to drop Kwong. I think the story for me becomes who's the left side guy that they
Hmm.
get, or Christian can play both.
Exactly. That's
So
what I'm saying. It's they can be nimble when it comes to this free agency auction. If they want to go left, they
yep,
can. If you want to go right, you can. Go best player available. Maybe you look to make a trade in the next waiver period after this auction draft. There's a lot of options for
yep.
these teams. Yeah. And moving along, we have the DC Pickleball Team, another team that made the playoffs last year. And they just made the trade, sending Viv Glosman, who cost $0 plus cash, for Jackie Kawamoto, who cost roughly $140,000 to keep.
With that trade, DC is now the second best, maybe third best women's team overall. I love that team. When we start talking about third shot drops and drips, Jackie and Rachel are 2 of the people that everybody knows has some of the best third shot drops and drips, and them being a duo is very scary for whoever they're playing. This seems like a no-brainer to me. I think they have to drop James with his obviously his highs are some of the highest highs that exist, but he's got this floor that's down
Hmm.
there. And his inconsistency plus his cost, I think they can drop him and get whatever left side guy they want in place of him, or just get him back and run it
Yeah,
back.
and
But
maybe
I
get him
think,
back cheaper.
I mean, and exactly right.
Yeah, I think they have to drop one of the men. They just made this trade to pair up these two women, so it's going to be one of the men. Deckel had a really good 2024. Uh, I think he overperformed his expectations, and James Acknowledge, to be frank, was the opposite of that. He underperformed his 2024. I don't think he was fully healthy for a lot of the year. So
Yep.
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see James being the player they move on from here.
We'll move on to the Arizona
Yeah, this
Drive.
is another interesting one. They're another
Very.
team.
I have no idea. I have no idea what they're going to do. Let's lay out the situation though. We have Andre Diascu, who is going to cost $265,000 to keep. Dylan is going to cost 177,500 to keep. Lacey only costs 20,500, and Jesse costs 5,500 to keep. Add in the wrinkle that just
Hmm.
happened to make sure that the audience is aware. Proton, they bought a controlling share of the drive. Andre is a Proton signed player. So even though he costs a lot and he's a really good player, I think they're keeping him, right? Like, have your signature
Hmm.
player play on your signature team that you own. Like,
It
that
makes
makes
sense.
sense to me. I have no idea what they do. What are your thoughts? I really don't know.
It just you have to move on from Dylan Frazier if you're going to keep Andre Diascu. They never really gelled as a team. I think he's got trade value. I don't think he's at a terrible price. What is he? 170,
Agreed.
177 and change. So you
Yep.
could probably get some cash in the door and send him someone. I think you probably are going to see them move on from Dylan just for because it never really came together.
Actually, they were the only team to go
Hmm.
guy in the draft order. And when they did it, I was like, oh my goodness, they're not going to lose a
Hmm.
match. Like, they're unbelievable. And they went like mid. They were very middling. They
Hmm.
weren't terrible by any stretch, but
But when
they
you sink
weren't
that
like,
draft capital in,
yeah,
they didn't get
yeah.
the return to justify it.
No, Lacey is a really high level trade because she
Hmm.
loves the left side. If somebody's looking for a left side woman, she's $20,000 to keep. And we could easily see Jessie dropped because she only costs 5,500. To
Can I
be
give you a
frank,
crazy idea of a team that would
okay,
be a surprisingly good fit for Jesse Irvin would be the St. Louis Shock if they move on from Kate Fahey. You could pair her up with Gabe. They've had a few deep runs together. I don't know.
yeah,
Maybe it's crazy, but just a random thought. So moving on, Carolina Pickleball Club, and honestly, just looking at this roster, I feel like they're better now than they were at the start of the year, just because I don't think it's a terrible idea to have Ben Johns and then two singles specialist women around him. We've got Caitlin Christian and Brooke Buckner. Those might be top to bottom like that. That's the best singles team women for Dreambreaker. I think it almost feels a little bit like the setup of New Jersey, where you have Annalie Waters. You're just going to hope she gets two wins, and then you've got good singles players around her.
it was weird because Caitlin and Brooke are easily both top five singles players right now, but they both did not do well in Dream Breakers last year, um, which is surprising.
But I think
But I think that they
you
could
just ride that
probably
out and hope that's going to correct itself. They're
right,
so
right,
swingy.
over time the averages. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. If I had to guess, Carolina tries to trade Colin to one of the upcoming teams that are going from Challenger to Premier and get Ben a different partner that is a little bit better at mixed.
And maybe the switch to side out scoring will help him out
Yeah,
since I mean him, Annalie, a few other players really seem to be on team side out. Moving on to another very interesting team. This so I said St. Louis was my one really interesting team, and the Dallas Flash are my probably second most interesting team here. They won it
got it.
all. I wouldn't be surprised at all to just see them drop a player, add him back, and just run it back. Like they already didn't spend all the money they could have last year, so maybe they make up for that this year by doing what it costs to keep the team together.
Yeah, I mean, this one actually isn't that interesting to me just because, like, okay, so we have JW only costs 195, Georgia only costs 142,000, Tyra only costs 92, and then we have Augie at 10,500. So it's like either of those women is going to cost you a ton to try to buy back. And Augie and Tyra are really good together. So I think they just drop Augie and pick him right back up and run it back.
Yeah, I think that's probably what we see too. It's just how much does that cost? We'll have to see. It's just so hard to grasp my head around. Like, what are these players going to go for? We've never seen it before, so uh,
Yeah.
you got to wonder.
Okay, let's move on to Utah. Utah, by far, out of all of the premier level teams last year going into this year, has the cheapest roster to keep. And their decision is already made for them unless they want to drop more players. So they have Connor at 70,000, Tyler's at 29,000, and Alex cost them a whopping $500 to keep. Technically on their roster was Jeannie Bouchard, but she was picked up after, so she has to be dropped. Their total roster only costs just under 100,000, and then they have the option to pick up, a good woman in the draft and go from there.
Yeah,
So I don't see any reason to do anything different than that unless they want to move on from one of those players.
yeah. They drafted cheap. They didn't even use all their monopoly money, funny money points, and then they traded players and got even cheaper. So I think they're just gonna get the best available but not too expensive women and just kind of ride from
Yeah.
there. Okay, so now we move on to the four teams that have been promoted from Challenger League. These are the teams that made the semifinal last year. So these are the four teams that didn't pay the original fee to just get into Premier League initially. Maybe that means they're less willing to spend money. Maybe that means since they saved that money, they're willing to come in and make a splash. What do we think these teams are going to do? I guess we'll start off with the Miami Pickleball Club.
Miami won the whole thing, and they kind of have what they're doing kind of laid out for them due to the rules. Millie Rain and Erik Onsens have signed with the UPA, so they do not need to be dropped. But Bobby is not signed with the UPA, and Noah Cleef is signed, but he was brought on as a waiver.
Hmm.
So they have to drop Bobby and Noe. Moving on, we have the easiest
Yeah.
decisions. I think I've said that a couple times now, but this one I think does take the trump card here. The Chicago Slice, as it currently stands, does not have a player on their roster that they can keep. So they have Jack Monroe, Allison Harris, Brennan Long, and Megan Fudge, all of whom cannot be kept because they're not signed. They're going to have to purchase 6 draft auction slots as opposed to everybody else's 3 or 4.
Like they're allowed to trade Jack Monroe. It's just whoever they trade him to
Yeah,
has to drop him. So like they can still send these roster slots basically out with some cash and maybe get somebody from that's on a challenger roster, maybe any of these other teams that know they're going to have to drop a player anyway. That's kind of how you can just get some cash in the door for them if you're not going to kind of go and reacquire that player. Like maybe we talked about Columbus with Jay DeVilliers. If they don't want to keep him, they know they're going to drop him. You might as well sell him off to somebody. But then again, it just comes down to can that team acquire those players for cheaper just naturally in free agency? So I don't know. It's kind of a whole once again moving target, but really
right.
interesting situation Chicago's found themselves in because Jack Monroe and Megan Fudge would be all things considered coming up from Challenger League like a pretty solid starting point.
Next up, we have the SoCal Hard Eights. Interesting situation for them. I do believe this is the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this. Like you said, it's very difficult with rosters and who is signed, who isn't signed. I'm using a ton of sources to try to figure out who is signed and isn't. I'm hoping MLP will give media the actual like eligible UPA signed players before the draft. We'll see if that happens. But to my knowledge, Irina and Erik are signed on a different type of deal than most others, and then Max and Yana are not signed, so they would have to drop Max and Yana. They could keep Irina and Erik. I don't think Irina is a premier level player anymore.
Maybe not bad
Um,
as a sub woman, like if you just want to
Right.
keep her
She
on
no, yeah. And plus like her knowledge and
hmm
experience, maybe they just keep because it doesn't cost them anything to keep
hmm
her, right? So maybe they just keep Erik and Irina and then fill out their roster with 4 other people. But
Yeah.
they have to drop the other 2.
It'll be
Yep.
tough for a lot of these teams coming up from Challenger, which maybe isn't a bad thing. You just got promoted. That's kind of how it is in like other leagues. I guess
Right.
I can really only think
Right.
of soccer. When you get promoted, like it's not like you're going to instantly compete.
I come from soccer. The only other thing is like in the EPL, if I get promoted from the championship to the Premier League basically gives me almost $100 million.
Moving
Uh,
along. the
Yep.
Atlanta Bouncers, who I'm going to say have the single best player for the price. Jaume Martinez-Vic for $0 is probably like the most valuable upside to cost player in the entire league, maybe.
Probably. I would agree with that. If you're Atlanta's GM and I call you, I can only offer you 200,000. 200,000 is the max for a trade. Are you taking 200,000 for Jaume?
If you also throw in $200,000 for Todd, and then we game the system, and I get $400,000 from you.
Okay, that's the way to get. I didn't think of
I,
that.
I don't know if that works or
You are a
not, but
sneaky, sneaky man, Mr. Klitsch. Wow. Okay. You
so
pay 200,000 for Jaume, and then you pay 200,000 for any of the other three players, really, and then you just drop that player.
you might get some looks. You might get a call from Samin if you try to do this, but
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah. You're trying to game the system, and
yeah.
I'm here for it.
One thing I've been thinking about with Atlanta is if, as we predicted, if we think Dallas is going to end up dropping Augie and then trying to buy him back, if I'm Atlanta, pairing Augie with Jame
Oh
is
yeah.
very appealing. And that's kind of the risk these teams that want to run it back run. You drop Augie, like, yeah, you can go pay what it costs to get him back, but somebody else can also pay what it costs to steal him from you.
First few picks, all of a sudden Atlanta's bidding and Augie's not like still available. Dallas probably gets a little scared
Hmm.
because they're like, what's going on? So that'll throw a wrinkle in for sure. So we went over all of the premier level teams, and I know we probably don't need to go over all of the challenger level teams, but I just want to point out a couple of players that I think might add trade value to those premier level teams. So Pablo on the Brooklyn Aces only costs $6,500 to keep.
Especially he's been playing well on PPAs, and honestly, he wasn't playing bad for the Ranchers either. They just, I mean, they just kind of
Right.
caught lightning in a bottle
Yeah,
a little
he
bit. Yeah.
Elise only costs
Hmm.
9,000. Her and Tyra on the PPA tour are playing amazing.
Other players that were
I don't.
sent down was Andrea Coop. She was traded down to
Yep.
Challenger. You'd have to imagine with expanded rosters. She's probably like
Yeah.
last year was probably right on that fringe of the women that would be considered premier level. So probably a spot for her, or at least to be considered. If I mean, if it came down to it, and that's your third woman, like you'd be pretty happy with that being your
Oh yeah,
sub.
for
Yeah.
sure. And she only costs you 5,500 to
Uh-huh.
keep. Like, no brainer. Las Vegas is super interesting to me. Rafa
Hmm.
is there. He definitely did not have the best year ever in Challenger. I don't know if anybody trades for him, but he is $0. You love like Jaume's value at 0 because he's so good.
Hmm.
I also love Zoe Wong's
Yeah.
value at 0. I think she is definitely a premier level player, and somebody should be knocking on Steve Deacon's door, asking him how much Zoe
You know who
costs.
I like her going to is Carolina Pickleball Club because
Yeah,
then you could get her next to Brooke Buckner. They've played some PPAs together. You still have good singles talent around as well. That'd be interesting. That might be.
and then oh, okay, now we're going down a rabbit hole, but we're here. So we have Ben, we have Zoe and Brooke, and we Ben has talked ad nauseum about loving lefties. We just get some sort of lefty to go with Ben.
Yeah, maybe they trade and get Pablo too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So we just made the Carolina
These are
roster for
free
them. You're
ideas for you.
welcome.
These are free ideas.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
There are definitely players who are in Challenger right now that should like have the level to be in Premier. It's just going to be interesting. Is a Premier level team going to be willing to pay the Challenger team
Hmm.
enough to dissuade them
I mean, if I'm a
from?
challenger level team, like why the hell not? You don't even know the formats change so frequently. If I can just cash these players out for some money, like I think I'm probably a seller if I'm a current challenger league team right now.
Yeah, for sure. There's
Are they
no
even
like.
playing for promotion? Like, are more teams getting
No, they're
promoted?
not.
Yeah.
No. So yeah, like everybody's automatically promoted next year. Now, okay, wait, let's back up for a second. Just announced today that
Mhm.
MLP is looking to sell those two teams that they bought back, which is the
Yeah.
Mashers and the ATX somethings.
The Austin
Um,
pickleballers, Austin, Texas pickleballers.
okay, there you go. So they are looking to get owners in for 2026. So my question for that is, okay, we're at 16 right in 2025, we're at 16 teams in Premier and we're at 6 for Challenger. If we added those two other teams, do they automatically just get into Premier and then you have 24 teams in Premier, or what are we doing there?
I feel like that's what
Um,
they would do. I just wish they would have stuck with their original promotion and relegation system. It would have been so entertaining to watch teams scrap
Agreed.
for those bottom spots and get promoted, but it is what it is,
Agreed.
I guess it's easier for them to sell a team that's in Premier League than to go out and try and sell a Challenger League team.
I'm with you. If I'm a challenger level team this year and somebody comes knocking on my door with a little bit of cash for any of my free players to keep, I am probably taking that cash.
Yeah. So I think that about does it. We've ran through all 16 Premier League teams. We touched briefly on the 6 teams down in Challenger, some players that maybe will get the call up. Is there anything else we need to talk about?
I don't think so. I think we hit everything.
I'm going to try to get this out as fast as possible because otherwise we run the risk of it becoming stale before I even hit publish. So hopefully you'll see
Right.
this video uploaded before any other blockbuster trades happen. But if there are blockbuster trades, rest assured that Erik will have you covered. Make sure to follow him on Twitter/X and follow along everything he publishes on the Dink. He does amazing work there. Really just probably like the best coverage out there, I think, is coming from Erik on the Dink right now. So it should be on your
Appreciate
your
that.
your 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 reading list if you're trying to keep up with the ever changing landscape. He's the guy to follow.
Appreciate that, Matty. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right. Cool. We did it.